Well, vulnerability scanning is the process of identifying weaknesses, right? It's identifying weaknesses across our systems, computer networks, computer infrastructure, application infrastructure, and basically it's defining those vulnerabilities that could potentially, and I say potentially because the likelihood of that being exploited. So when we talk about vulnerability scanning, it's one of the most important aspects across any information security management protocol or any information security control framework that we currently have in place across an organization. And it's kind of and always is used to assess the security posture of the organization's infrastructure, right? And there's multiple areas of vulnerability scanning, and that's what we're going to define in this video. So the very first component that I want to sort of touch on over here is our first area of scanning is our credential. So creds versus no creds. And what's the difference between the two? So when we talk about credentials, think of this in terms of supplying a username or a password, right? We're going to have to provide it with some sort of authentication, and then that authentication is going to go away and then authenticate to maybe a web, a www, like a web server of some sort, or a web function or web application. And then it's going to go away and it's going to assess the vulnerabilities of that application. It's going to tell us the underlying infrastructure. It's going to tell us the app versions, maybe the hosting information, the patch levels. It's going to tell us the application that's potentially running, the software versions of those. So we're basically using a bunch of credentials that are going to go away and they're going to authenticate against that infrastructure. And it could be application, and that's the most commonly used for the type of credential, vulnerability scanning that we do use. And then we can also do that with the network side of things as well. So they're network based, we've got application based, and it's basically taking those applications and then authenticating with some sort of credential. Now, the other piece of that is non-creds, right? And this is typically seen as, and I like to call this more of a light version, only because typically when we talk about non-credential vulnerability assessments, it doesn't go into as much depth as you would with credentials, right? And if you've got credentials, that's the whole area that we want to test the underlying functions. Now if we talk about web application functions, there's different functionality within the application, there's different users, different roles, different requirements. And if we have to do split testing across all those different parameters, chances are we're going to be doing a lot more specific testing opposed to, let's just say there's a web application function here, and then we've got a little login portal here that says username, password. Now, typically on an engagement, you'll have to scope out the actual requirements with the customer, and you'll have to define what you're going to be testing on this application, what's going to be out of scope, what's going to be in scope, are there any specific do's and don'ts, and you need to understand the infrastructure that it's built on, because if something does go wrong, you need to sort of understand how to remediate and get past that. So what I'm getting to with this is typically when you discuss and you sort of scope this out, the customer may just say, well, based on this application, we don't really want to be tested in the back end, meaning we don't want to test the functions and features. Just tell us what you can see from the external perimeter. Now, chances are that this little box here may be out of scope for SQL injection attacks, cross-site scripting, or any credential-based attacks. So we may pull a scanner or a vulnerability tool at it and say, well, tell us what you can see. And it'll come back and say, well, this version is running on Nginx XYZ, whatever version it's running on, or if it's running on an Apache server, or whatever thing it's running on. And that's going to give us sort of the underlying infrastructure where it's potentially hosting on. It's going to give us that sort of overview or that typical light version of that application. And the same is true for the network. If we don't have those network credentials, maybe there's certain out of scope access of things that we cannot be doing. So it's kind of seen as, maybe we can just identify ports and services, and that's kind of pretty much it. So it's just an overview, or if you want to call it a 10,000 foot view of either the infrastructure or the application. So that's pretty much it when we talk about credentials and non-credential attacks. Now, if we continue moving this way, the other area that we want to talk about and cover is two other things. So we've got, let's draw my circle here. So we have our server, and then we have our agents. right? And then when we talk about server, well, typically you'll go away and you build out a vulnerability management server, and then that server will go away and it will start scanning a bunch of stuff in the environment, whether it's servers, workstations, network devices, Wi-Fi, printers, etc. And it'll do that typically over, common network infrastructure. So if you've got a LAN segment, you'll point it to that IP address, it'll go away and do that. And sometimes the challenges have been when typically now where we've got a lot of people working from remote, and we've got an on-prem solution like this, that's a vulnerability server or a management tool that we have, chances are that it won't scan devices if they're outside of that network. So people and organizations have gone away and they've deployed agents. So what will typically happen is you've got a bunch of machines and you typically roll out an agent that gets installed on them. And the benefit of this is, let's just say we're a mining organization and we've got a bunch of miners, right? And these guys kind of go down in the trenches and they operate, 500 foot deep. They've got to take their laptops, they've got to go down there and do some investigations or, log whatever they need to log. So what would end up happening is these agents will go out onto their machines and it will continuously update based on, what they're running, obviously giving us a view of that infrastructure as well. So when we come back and we log into this machine, a vulnerability management server, then, all the staffing team who are either the miners, and we've segregated them out so we know who they are. What will typically happen is if these guys lose internet access, the agents kind of still run on those machines. So when they come back online and they connect to the Wi-Fi, then those callouts will come back to our vulnerability management server, and then we can log in and see the additional updates that have happened. So the kind of cool thing about that is it's typically out of band, which is great. It works through multiple connections, and we don't need to be mindful of doing scanning across bandwidth or limited bandwidth networks, which have sometimes been a real concern doing vulnerability scanning, especially across network infrastructure. So continuing on, the next part here, as we continue our discussion of vulnerability scanning, is our active and passive state. So let me just do a big A for active and P for passive. When we talk about active and passive, so let's just maybe touch on the passive component first. So what's passive scanning? So passive scanning is basically, what's defined as passive, right? So passive scanning is usually false positives. So in most traditional vulnerability scanning tools, what ends up happening is it's a bunch of false positives, meaning vulnerabilities have been positively identified, but they could potentially be false. So they need some sort of manual interaction. And then we've got to go away and either put in some sort of script. If it's a SQL injection, we've got to go away and then validate that, okay, SQL injection actually is intended on this application and it actually works. Most times it's false and it comes up with a negative connotation saying that the vulnerability exists, but in hindsight, it does not. So it kind of gives us that, false impression. There's a lot of manual labor to it that we've got to go away, do a lot of the manual investigations, and we basically waste time. We waste time and we waste resources trying to define what these false requirements are, and then going away and manually exploiting or manually validating those vulnerabilities. So I'm just going to say waste of resources. The active component, on the other hand, when we talk about vulnerability scanners, well, this part, it kind of takes this feature and we sort of leverage it with the active connotation to it. So what ends up happening is those vulnerability scanners will go away and then they'll actively scan. And at times, it'll actively exploit. Now, you and I may be watching this and consuming this. Sometimes this becomes a bit problematic in the environment. One is because when we introduce risk management into the play, chances are we've got to fine tune and tune certain aspects of the exploitation, right? So imagine this thing goes out and it starts exploiting 100 different servers in your environment because you're running Windows Server 2012 and there's a known vulnerability, and it starts just doing mission critical exploits. Now, and those systems get shut down for whatever reason. So we've got to go away and define what those high, medium, and low, risk management side of things kind of looks like, because we can then define and say, well, if it is a high risk category platform, then don't actually exploit, just define what they are. If it is maybe medium and low, then you have the ability to go away and actively exploit. And we have to define what they are very cautiously. Obviously, if they're mission critical controls, if there's an RCE of some sort, it can go away and then it will do that exploit. But then, chances are with a RCE or a kernel exploit, it's going to impact the actual service and operability of that system. So we need to be really mindful that, one, the great thing is that it reduces those false positives, but on the other hand, it could have system impact. So active testing is quite great in that sense, but there is quite a bit of fine tuning that we need to define. And obviously, we then have to define the actual critical or the actual risk appetite based on those active scanners. And the final part here is our reporting. Right? And we've got to all put this into a report somewhere. Someone's got to consume it and understand it, whether it's the BIS, whether it's the I was thinking in terms of risk, but whether it's the business, whether it's a technical component, and usually the reports, and I think in the next video, by a little bit of demand, some people have just been asking in terms of, can you show us a report? And I've got one here that I'll pull up in the next video, then I can show you a traditional report, how that kind of looks like. For this example, let's just maybe go through, what the reports kind of include and what they don't include, and we'll wrap up there. So anytime we talk about vulnerability, it's basically ranking the vulns, right? So we want to define, the critical aspect of, 1 to 10, typically 10 being the most critical, 1 being the lowest critical, and it's got some sort of association with the CVSS. So CVSS is the common vulnerability scoring system. It's very common across our technological and security infrastructure, and the current version is 3. And that basically ranks vulnerabilities from, a critical risk, which are 10, remote code executions, kernel exploits, high risk vulnerabilities, all the way to a 1. And it's easily sort of consumed, where you can sort of go away, you can read about it, you can define how it was, scored based on the impacts, based on the confidentiality, based on the integrity, based on the networks, and you can define how they kind of look. So we can then put them into a report, and your report will have your business risks on the business impacts. I'm just going to write BI for business impacts. And then from there, you can say, well, anything from a 10 to a 6 are considered, 10 is your critical. 6, I would say, you've got your maybe 6 to 8 could be highs. And then 5, whatever may be a medium, whatever they look like. So I'm just sort of spitballing right now. And then anything under a 3 is your lows or your informational. And then you can sort of define each of these critical controls and say, okay, well, we're going to start off with number 10, any 10 critical risks. No, okay, great. Let's go to number 8. And then number 8 will have maybe its highs. And then, those high risks are X, Y, Z, whatever they are. And then you just sort of work down the chain. So typically you'll have, your report function. Now, reports can span, maybe traditionally maybe 15 to 30 pages. You've got some sort of findings in there that are sort of speaking to the business risks. So I'm just going to put in here, business risks isn't always, you must always speak to the business. And then from there, you can obviously go away, and then you can have a more defined vulnerability sort of database. And then you can have single line items that sort of define, the name of the risk. You've got your description. You have your vuln rating. And this sort of makes it easy to sort of consume, right? Like if I've got an Excel spreadsheet here that most organizations use, and they can just drop down and say, okay, well, our description is only a 10 category and higher, or a 10 category and that's it. So you may have a list of critical vulnerabilities with the names, the descriptions, the affected assets, and then you can go away. And then obviously, your remediation here that sort of defines how you intend to remediate. So that's basically when we have our report function, we want to then be able to, the main cause for reporting is focusing our efforts. And that's where we allow us to to focus our efforts. So once we've defined what the vulnerabilities are, we've got a scoring system, and then we've articulated those business risks, we can go away and then put that into a nice fancy report back to executive, report back to our team, and then we can go about our vulnerability management structure on our day-to-day basis. So I hope you found this video useful. In the next video, we will be talking more in terms of the reporting, what to include, what not to include, and I'll see you in the next video.